welcome to pre-recorded Roger's Readings. Yes, I'm not here. Well, I'm here now, obviously, because this has been pre-recorded last week, which is why I'm wearing exactly what I was wearing last week for Paddington Monday. I'm actually, at the moment, rehearsing with some musicians. First time, so I'm a little bit nervous about it. But I've been trying to do this for a while, and things have been conspiring against us. But we've finally got together, and we're hopefully having a really good time at the moment. So anyway, so you wouldn't miss out on the really exciting things that are going on with Paddington here and now, I thought what we'll do is we shall pre-record the final story in the book, which is called Paddington's Christmas Surprise. Yes, okay. Chapter 7. So, if you are sitting comfortably, I'll have a quick slurp of coffee as per usual. Of course, the little fellow is here. Give us a wave. Yeah, little wave from Paddington. Just so you know, this is all real, even though it's pre-recorded. Yes, Paddington's Christmas surprise. Do you remember last week he had a surprise visitor? Yeah. There is the first picture. How lovely. It's Uncle Pastuzo. Yeah. Okay. Enveloping Paddington in his poncho, Uncle Pastuzo gave him a huge hug. I thought I would never find you, sombrido. You ask me how? It's not a story. I'll tell you some one time. Been twice round the world since last July. You must be dying for a cup of tea, said Mrs. Brown. Along with Mr. Brown, she had arrived on the scene rather later than the others, and they were both trying to catch up on events. Letting go of Paddington, their visitor produced a large watch on the end of a chain. Gone 10 of the clock, and I no have breakfast yet. Mercy me! Exclaimed Mrs. Bird. I'll get you something straight away. Uncle Pastuzo kissed her hand. Gracias, beautiful señorita, he said. That is the music to my ears. We have several kinds of cereal. Mrs. Bird went quite pink as she began ticking off various alternatives on her fingers. There's porridge, kippers, bacon and eggs, sausages, black pudding, kedgeree, fried potato, toast and marmalade. It sounds great to me, señorita, said Uncle Pastuzo, smacking his lips. The Browns exchanged glances. From the back view of Mrs. Bird as she bustled off towards the kitchen, it was hard to tell what she was thinking, and they feared the worst, but a moment or so later they relaxed when they heard the sound of pots and pans being put to work. You know something about travel? Said Uncle Pastuzo. It makes you hungry. However did you find us? Asked Mrs. Brown. It was written in the stars. Heard tell on the grapevine that there was a bear living in London. Had a railroad station named after him. I think, said Mrs. Brown gently, you'll find it was the other way round. That is not how it was told to me, signora, said Uncle Pastuzo. So when I reach London, I head for the station, and there I see a newspaper headline. Knew at once who they were talking about. He turned to Paddington, began cruising the area. Next thing I know, you are coming out of a shop that has big globe in the window. Oyster Travels, said Paddington. Right in one. So what happens? I get out of my limo and shout your name. But by then you had vanished into the crowd. I was hoping to take everyone round the world too, said Paddington sadly, but I only had one air mile. Sabrina, when I get back home, you will have all mine, said Uncle Pastuzo. By now there should be enough to take you anywhere you wish." "I don't know anyone who's been round the world once," said Jonathan, "let alone twice." "I took the wrong path in Africa," said Uncle Pastuzo simply. "Turned right instead of left. Went back on myself. Thought everything was beginning to look the same." "How about your car?" asked Mr. Brown. "I wouldn't want it to get towed away. They're rather hot on that kind of thing round here." "No problem," said Uncle Pastuzo cheerfully. "Fits your front drive like a dream, all 10 metres of it. Could have been made to measure." "I'm sure Paddington's uncle will have it moved when you want to get yours out, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, catching the look on her husband's face. "Better that than to have it towed away." "Too true it is," agreed Uncle Pastuzo. "Rules and regulations. People invent the motor car and make things so you can't live without them. Then others come along and make it impossible to live with it. Poppycock!" "Yes, well," began Mr. Brown. "You try saying that to a traffic warden." "I did," said Uncle Pastuzo. "One of them tried to give me a ticket when I came out of that oyster place. Only been in there 2 minutes. Producing a giant dagger from under his poncho, he ran his free paw along the length of the blade. "I tell him, you want to watch it, gringo." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I hope you didn't give him our address." Uncle Pastuzo chuckled. "Me? I was not born yesterday. Give him your neighbour's number. Hombre name of Curry. Heard all about him from Lucy. Seems you two don't get on too well." "You're in touch with Paddington's Aunt Lucy?" said Mrs. Brown, anxious to change the subject. "First stop when I set out," said Uncle Pastuzo. "There she was, large as life, and twice as happy in the home for retired bears, knitting away in her rocking chair like there was no tomorrow. Could hardly hear myself for all the needles clicking. Tea cosies, bed socks, scarves. You call that retirement?" "She'd tell me your address. Only thing is, I remember the number of your house, but forget the name of the road. Not like darkest Peru. Where I live, we only got one. Straight up to the top of the mountain, straight back down again. Got the rest of the address from that oyster place. That was when I know it was meant." He turned to Paddington. "Spoke to a man in there with a bad twitch. Said he knew you well, Sobrino. Seems like you are not the apple of his eye." "You will be staying, of course," broke in Mrs. Brown. "We can make a room ready while you are having your breakfast." Uncle Pastuzo glanced out at the garden. "No need," he said, pointing to the summer house. "Give me hammer and nails, and that will suit me just fine, like a palace." "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Wouldn't you be cold?" "You haven't stepped outside in the Andes in the middle of winter," said Uncle Pastuzo. "That's true," admitted Mrs. Brown. "Wake up most mornings with icicles on your whiskers. Those that have them," he added hastily, not wishing to offend. "I'd better move the lawn-mower," said Mr. Brown. He paused. Forgive my asking, but why do you need a hammer and nail?" "I need somewhere to hang this." Uncle Pastuzo reached for his hat. "Home is where you hang it." With a quick flick, he sent his own hat flying across the room. It hovered for a brief moment near the ceiling before landing gently on top of a standard lamp. "Gosh!" said Jonathan admiringly. "I wish I could do that." "I teach you," said Uncle Pastuzo. "It's what they call a knack." "It may be a knack," said Mrs. Brown, fearing for her china, "but it might not be so easy with a school cap." "Meantime," said Uncle Pastuzo, ignoring the interruption, "I give Senorita Bird a hand. Make sure she does eggs the way I like, over easy sunny side up." Maybe I come too? Asked Paddington eagerly. There's Uncle Pastuzo's hat on the standard lamp. The Browns looked at each other when they were on their own. What do you think he meant when he said, "Home is where you hang your hat"? Asked Mrs. Brown. It sounded a bit permanent to me. How long is a piece of string? Said Mr. Brown. I know one thing. If breakfast is anything to go by, we'd better get some more supplies in before the shops close for Christmas. In the end, it was Mrs. Bird who answered most of their questions. Clearly, she couldn't wait to unburden herself when she returned at long last. That should keep them quiet for a while, she said, undoing her apron. Besides, there is a lot of catching up to do. I've left Paddington in charge of the toast and marmalade. Tell us the worst, said Mr. Brown. Well, Mrs. Bird took a deep breath. Paddington's uncle lives high up in the Andes Mountains in an area which is rich in all kinds of precious metals. Copper, gold, silver, platinum. Now, who do you think benefits the most? The people who dig for it, suggested Jonathan. Wrong, said Mrs. Bird. Their employers? hazarded Judy. Wrong again, said Mrs. Bird. If the car parked in our front drive is anything to go by, said Mr. Brown, Uncle Pastuzo. Right, said Mrs. Bird. He has a little store at the top of one of the biggest mines, and when the workers come up at the end of their shift, hot, tired, and above all thirsty, he's there, ready and waiting with hot dogs and ice-cold drinks. They may have spent their time underground looking for precious metals, but Uncle Pastuzo has his own gold mine at the top. In any case, there is nowhere else to spend their earnings. Having grown wealthy over the years, he now wants to see a bit of the world while he can. As he says, you can't take it with you. He told you all that while you were cooking his breakfast, said Mrs. Brown. And a lot more besides, said Mrs. Bird. There's nothing like getting together over a kitchen stove to make people open up. While you were chatting, did you get any idea of how long he plans to stay? Asked Mr. Brown. As far as I'm concerned, said Mrs. Bird, he can make it as long as he likes. He has the same big brown eyes as certain others I could name, she added dreamily, and he's very polite. You can see where Paddington gets it from, along with his Aunt Lucy, of course. So, what more can you tell us? Asked Mrs. Brown. Just you wait and see, said Mrs. Bird mysteriously. It's his idea, and I wouldn't want to spoil it, especially as it's meant to be a surprise for Paddington. And there, for the time being, matters rested. After his mammoth breakfast, Paddington's uncle went outside to his car and returned carrying a suitcase. Laying it down in the middle of the floor, he opened the lid, pressed a button, and a small folding bed began to erect itself. It was followed by a whir and a hiss of air as a mattress took shape. Bought it in Hong Kong, he said briefly. Are you sure you wouldn't like something bigger? Asked Mrs. Brown. Uncle Pastuzo shook his head. They say that to me when I stay at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, France. They don't like it when I say I prefer my bed to theirs. I tell them if they don't let me use my bed, then I'll camp out in front of their hotel and hang my washing out to dry. They like that even less. It's a wonder they didn't have you arrested, said Mr. Brown. Uncle Pastuzo jingled some coins in a trouser pocket. Not so as you were to notice, Buenos noches. Having said good night, Paddington's uncle opened the French windows, gathered his belongings together, and headed towards the summer house. "I'd better move the lawn-mower," said Mr. Brown. "Don't forget the hammer and nails," called Mrs. Brown. "It must be nice to be so independent," she continued, closing the door after them, "but it is rather unsettling for the rest of us. I wonder when he wants to be woken." "I should leave him for the time being," said Mrs. Bird. "It's best to let sleeping bears lie." "Perhaps he's hibernating," suggested Jonathan. "Our geography mistress says bears don't hibernate in the true sense of the word," said Judy. "On the other hand, some of them do go to sleep for months at a time. Perhaps we should ask Paddington." "Don't go putting ideas into that bear's head," warned Mrs. Bird. "He has more than enough in there already." As things turned out, however, they were all wrong about Uncle Pastuzo. The next morning he was up bright and early, and after announcing he had matters to deal with, disappeared soon after breakfast and didn't arrive back until late that afternoon. "If you don't mind me asking," said Mrs. Brown, "what do you picture doing for the rest of the day?" "You mean, what are we doing?" said Uncle Pastuzo. There was a brr toot from the limousine outside. "Better hurry," said Uncle Pastuzo, "otherwise we miss flight." "Miss the flight?" echoed the Browns. "That is what they call it," said Uncle Pastuzo, ushering everyone out of the door. Climbing into the front seat, he settled down alongside the driver and began issuing instructions. But they were lost on the Browns as they entered via the rear doors. Paddington nearly fell over backwards with surprise when he climbed inside. The last person he expected to see was Mr. Gruber, seated in an armchair at the far end. "It is a small world, Mr. Brown," said his friend, "and as I think I once said to you, it gets smaller all the time. I feel very honoured to have been invited." "It's very James Bond," said Judy, eyeing a bank of television screens. "Everything except a nuclear warhead," agreed Jonathan. "I don't think I could live with those curtains," said Mrs. Bird, casting an expert eye over the furnishings. "They're far too grand, and they don't go with the carpet." "I hope we don't come across anyone we know," said Mrs. Brown, settling herself down in another armchair. "Perhaps we'd better draw them, just in case." "They won't be able to see us," said Jonathan, pointing to the tinted glass. "But if you like—" Running his eyes over a control console in front of them, he pressed a button and the curtains slid together. "Do you know what's happening, Mr. Gruber?" asked Paddington. But Mr. Gruber wasn't letting on. "It is something I have always wanted to do, Mr. Brown," was all he would say. Mrs. Bird was equally tight-lipped on the subject, and for most of the journey everyone else was kept so busy trying out the various gadgets they hardly noticed where they were going anyway. When they eventually drew to a halt, Jonathan pressed the button again and the curtains parted. He and Judy joined Paddington at one of the windows. "Guess what?" said Jonathan. "It looks like a bicycle wheel to me," said Paddington. "It's called the London Eye," said Judy. "We're all going for a ride on it," explained Mr. Gruber. "We're going for a ride on a bicycle wheel?" exclaimed Paddington. "I hope we don't get a puncture." "There's no fear of that," said Mr. Gruber. "If you take a closer look, you will see there are lots of cabins all round the rim. We shall be travelling in one of those." "They look as though they are made of glass," said Judy. can't, of course, but it does mean you can look every which way while you're going round. And you can stand up and walk around, added Jonathan. 32 of them, said Uncle Pastuzo, helping the others disembark from the car. Each one holds 25 passengers. That is nearly 800 people. I book through your friend at the oyster shop, Sobrino, and I pay extra so we have a whole one to ourselves. He is so pleased, he say any time you want a holiday, you go see him. Mrs. Bird's right, whispered Jonathan. Bears do fall on their feet. I fix everything, said Uncle Pastuzo as her hostess came forward to greet them. We take what is called the VIP trip. Tee-hee. Tee-hee, repeated Mrs. Brown. Ought to be V.I.B. Very important bears. Doubled up with laughter at his own joke. Uncle Pastuzo followed on behind their escort. The timing was exactly right. As they arrived at the starting point, an empty capsule arrived. The doors slid open, and as they stepped aboard, the sun began to disappear behind the Houses of Parliament. For the first few minutes, as the wheel slowly revolved and they gathered height, Mr. Gruber pointed out many of the important landmarks still visible in the gathering dust to Paddington's uncle. Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, the many parks and lakes, and the British Telecom Tower, silhouetted like a pencil against the skyline. Paddington had visited many of them over the years, but somehow, as London began to unfold before their eyes, they seemed to take on a different life. The buildings evolving into tiny scale models of the real thing, the streets peopled by ants, and model cars going hither and thither everywhere you looked. Is the only way to see the world, said Uncle Pastuzo, pleased at everyone's reaction, from on high and away from the crowds. As darkness fell still further and the capsule gradually rose higher and higher, lights began appearing all over London. Floodlit buildings came into view and Christmas lights twinkled in the night sky. They even had a brief glimpse of ice skaters on the far side of the river, further round to their right. There was one slight hiccup almost at the end of its journey when Uncle Pastuzo called them all together to see what he called something special. But by the time they had formed themselves into a group, the moment had passed. It had been one long series of magical moments, and in the rush to disembark, nobody noticed Uncle Pastuzo disappeared for a moment or two. In any case, they had grown used to his sudden comings and goings. On the journey home, Paddington joined in the general agreement that it was the best treat they'd had for a very long time. All the same, Mrs. Bird couldn't help noticing that in between whiles, both Paddington and his uncle were unusually quiet. She couldn't help wondering if all the talk about going around the world and now the trip on the London Eye had given Paddington itchy paws. But for the time being, she kept her thoughts to herself. There was no sense in spoiling everyone else's pleasure. Uncle Pastuzo dropped Mr. Gruber off first. You have been a good friend over the years to my sobrino, he said, shaking him warmly by the hand. For that I bless you. Somehow, as Mr. Gruber waved goodbye, it all seemed very final. The Browns' housekeeper had difficulty in getting to sleep that night. The result was she woke rather later than usual the next morning. Even so, the house felt strangely quiet. Slipping into a dressing gown, she was making her way downstairs when she happened to glance out of the landing window and realised Uncle Pastuzo's car was no longer in the driveway. Her heart missing a beat, she hastened back upstairs to Paddington's room. The duvet was pulled back, and there was a hollow in the mattress where he must have lain, but it felt cold to the touch. On the way down again, she found 2 envelopes lying on the front doormat, one marked Senorita Bird. She put it into her apron pocket for later, and the other was marked for Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Soon the whole household was awake to her calls, and everyone came rushing downstairs to see what the excitement was about. The note to Mr. and Mrs. Brown was typically short. "Been there, done that. Now it's time to go home," read Mr. Brown. "So, amigos, it is time to say adios and gracias." "That's nice," he said, once he got over the initial shock. "Somehow adios sounds better than goodbye. It's not quite so final." "And gracias is so much better than a simple thank you," agreed Mrs. Brown. "The thing is," said Mrs. Bird, searching for the right words and hardly able to find the right ones to say what was uppermost in her mind, "where's Paddington?" Something in the tone of her voice caused a ripple of apprehension to run through the others. "He was out in the garden the last time I saw him," said Jonathan. "I think he was doing some early morning digging." One glance through the dining room window was enough. Paddington nearly dropped his seaside spade with surprise when he suddenly found himself surrounded by the rest of the family. "Uncle Pastuzo left me a map he made. He doesn't like goodbyes, so he slipped it under my door last night after I went to bed." He held it up for the others to see. "I thought I'd better get up early in case Mr. Curry saw me and wanted to know what I was doing." "X marks the spot where you start," said Jonathan, looking at the roughly drawn map. "It says 10 paces north," said Judy, "then 5 paces east." "The trouble is," said Paddington, "I'm not sure which is north." "I'll get my spade," said Mr. Brown, by now as excited as the rest of them. Having followed the instructions, he ended up in the shrubbery. "That's my prize buddleia," he said. "It can't be under that. At least I hope it isn't." "It's probably a case of bear's paces," said Mrs. Brown. "They're not as long as ours. You better let Paddington have a go." Having first been pointed in the right direction, Paddington set out, while the others counted the steps as he went. Sure enough, this time the trail ended in the middle of a flower bed. Mr. Brown brushed aside a pile of leaves to reveal a freshly dug patch of earth, and after a few prods with the spade, he struck metal. "Brilliant!" exclaimed Jonathan. "I don't know about that," said Mr. Brown. "It's the box I keep my golf balls in. I hope they're all right." "Oh, do hurry up, Henry," called Mrs. Brown. "Paddington's waiting." "Why don't you have a go then?" said Mr. Brown, handing him the spade. Paddington needed no second bidding, and in no time at all he prized the box out of the ground and had the lid open. The first thing he came across was a canvas bag with his name on the tag. Pulling on the drawstrings, he felt inside and discovered it was full of foreign coins. "Uncle Pastuzo must have collected them while he was travelling around the world," said Jonathan, taking a closer look. "I bet they're worth a bomb." Underneath that, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, were 7 large, glossy photographs of the whole family taken inside the capsule on the London Eye. "So that's where he disappeared to," said Judy. "I saw a notice on the way in saying you pose at a certain point, a picture is automatically taken, ready to buy when you get off." "What a very kind thought," said Mrs. Brown. "We must have our friend Henry. It can have a place of honour on the mantelpiece." "I shall put mine by my bed," said Mrs. Bird. "We could take ours with us when we go back to school," said Judy. "And I shall put mine alongside Aunt Lucy's picture," said Paddington. "I'll give Mr. Gruber his tomorrow. I expect he would like it for the shop." "We shall miss Uncle Pastuzo," said Mrs. Brown on the way back to the house. "He may have been a bit of a whirlwind, but it will seem very quiet without him." At least that bear's ends are tied up now, said Mrs. Bird. It's always bothered me. Having overheard the conversation, as soon as he got indoors, Paddington hurried upstairs to his bedroom and examined his reflection carefully in the mirror. As ever, Mrs. Bird was right. He had no idea how or when it had happened, but Uncle Pastuzo must have done a good job. Everything was in its proper place. No matter which way he turned, he couldn't see the slightest sign of any knots. Later on that morning, the Browns heard the sound of hammering coming from Paddington's room. But everyone was so pleased by the fact that he was still with them, they pretended not to notice. I've been following Aunt Lucy's example, he announced that evening when they all went up to his room to say good night. I've been counting my blessings, except I wanted to do mine before I go to sleep. I have so many I may not have time tomorrow. I still have some important shopping to do, and I still need to go to the bank to get all Uncle Pastuzo's coins counted. I don't think you'll be very popular with the rest of the queue at this time of year, warned Mr. Brown. Anyway, said Mrs. Brown, you mustn't go spending the money on us. Your being here is the best present we could possibly have. Life just wouldn't be the same without you, added Mrs. Bird amid general agreement. Paddington pointed to a large nail on the back of his bedroom door. Uncle Pastuzo taught me one thing, he explained. Home is where you hang your hat. Removing his bush hat, he tossed it into the air. Much to his surprise, it landed back on his head. Never mind, Paddington, said Mrs. Brown amid the laughter that followed. Practice makes perfect, and from now on you have all the time in the world. And there it is, when he finally gets it right, on the back of the door. Wonderful, 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 wonderful. What a lovely book. And that is it for today's Paddington story. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, I think it's time we had a poem, don't you? I have the Kingfisher book of children's poetry here. So let's see if I can find a poem for you. TV by Eve Merriam. In the house of Mr. and Mrs. Spouse, he and she would watch TV, and never a word between them was spoken until the day the set was broken. Then, how do you do? Said he to she. I don't believe that we've met yet. Spouse is my name. What's yours? He asked. Why, mine's the same, said she to he. Do you suppose that we could be? But the sets came suddenly right about, and so they never did find out. Brilliant. Right, well, that is it for today. I will be back tomorrow for a live broadcast of the Terry Pratchett book, because of course it is Sir Terry Tuesday tomorrow, and we will have the third part of The Colour of Magic. So come on back for that tomorrow. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy, and above all, stay happy. Big smiles all around. Thank you for being with me. Till tomorrow. Take care. God bless.